With combat operations against Iran now stretching into their 13th day, the US has employed a wide variety of munitions against what's now more than a reported 6,000 targets struck. And while a lot of these weapons have already seen combat before, some are actually making their battlefield debut in this conflict, demonstrating the capabilities that they were designed to deliver, and if I'm honest, serving as a pretty important reminder that not all Pentagon acquisitions are boondoggles. And if you want a good example of what I mean, we really need look no further than Lockheed Martin's Precision Strike Missile, or Prism for short, which in its current form entered service in 2023. The Prism is a short-range ballistic missile capable of being launched from America's M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, or from the M270 Multiple Launch Rocket System. And in either case, it can strike stationary targets more than a reported 310 miles, or about 500 kilometers away. But recent reports now suggest the Prisms being slung at Iran right now might actually be even more capable than we were previously aware, potentially covering distances as far as 400 miles, roughly 643 kilometers, and we just confirmed a few hours ago that indeed, Prisms and their predecessor, the ATACMS, have also been used to strike Iranian warships and at least one submarine as this fight continues. Now, it's worth noting that those strikes were part of a broader effort to completely neutralize Iran's navy, and I might argue that that has already happened in just the first 12 days of fighting, with a reported 60 Iranian vessels struck out of a navy that had fewer than 67 armed ships, both functioning and non-functioning to begin with. And this is a very big deal for a bunch of reasons, but maybe the most direct is in the Army's ability to directly participate in this offensive from the ground in the surrounding region, adding its own long-range fires to aircraft and missile strikes deployed by warships at sea, carrier-based Navy fighters, and Air Force assets based both within and far beyond the region. So let's talk about the US Army's new Prism ballistic missile, why it seems to be a shining example of research and development gone right, and Lockheed Martin's big plans to make this technologically advanced weapon even more capable in the not-too-distant future. I'm Alex Hollings. Welcome to Firepower. Ground news helps you stay on top of what's going on in the world while also letting you see right through common forms of media bias and the sensationalism that has become so commonplace today. Ground news compiles stories from outlets all over the world and then sticks them all into one easy-to-read feed that doesn't just keep me up to date on what's going on out there, but also shows me the different ways media outlets cover the same story. You can even choose specific topics that you want to stay on top of, like the military, fighter aircraft, or the ongoing conflict in Iran. Like this story about the first air-to-air victory against a crewed aircraft for the F-35. Ground News has already gathered coverage of this story from 85 different news outlets, with 14 of them listed as politically centered. And here on the right side of the screen, you can see the bias distribution and factuality ratings for coverage of this story, with about 44% of outlets reporting on the story listed as right-leaning, and 76% of them rated for high factuality. And Ground News also shows you vital information about the outlet along with their headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, their corporate ownership, or any government affiliations. And I love the Ground News For You tab that helps me stay on top of topics that I identify as important to me. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and you know the drill. It can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or click on that link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that will help you stay on top of things. In 1980, the US Army started development on a new surface-to-surface missile that could replace its existing MGM-52 Lance tactical ballistic missiles. Now, tactical in this context is really meant as a measurement of range, with tactical really meaning close-range ballistic missile, rated to strike targets at distances of roughly 50 kilometers or around 31 miles through 300 kilometers or 186 miles. Now, the Lance's maximum range, covering both conventional and nuclear payloads, was just about 129 kilometers or about 80 miles. But when fielding its replacement, the Army wanted much longer legs, stretching out into the hundreds of kilometers in order to bridge the strike gap between shorter-ranged artillery and longer-ranged cruise missiles. And the result of that effort finally emerged in 1991 in the MGM-140, also known as the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, with a reported range at the time of roughly 165 kilometers, or just about 100 miles. Now, these 13-foot short-range ballistic missiles made their combat debut that same year as a part of Operation Desert Storm, with a reported 32 ATACMS launched into Iraq by Army M270 multiple launch rocket systems, which are effectively Bradley fighting vehicles modified to launch a dozen M26 and later M28 series 227mm unguided rockets, or by then, you could also carry two much larger ATACMS. Now, these weapons returned to Iraq once again in 2003 as a part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and by then, the Block 1A ATACMS had entered service with a huge boost in range out to 300 kilometers, or a bit better than 186 miles, while also boasting an advanced new GPS-assisted inertial guidance system, collectively making the weapon more reliable, more accurate, and just generally more useful on the battlefield. And as a result, these systems saw a substantial increase in use, with 450 ATACMS launched during just the first 3 years of Operation Iraqi Freedom. But these weapons really didn't make the leap into mainstream consciousness until much more recently, in 2023, when the Ukrainian military started to launch American-sourced ATACMS at Russian targets, striking deeper inside Russian-controlled territory than they could before, and even wiping out highly touted air defense assets like missile launchers for the S-300 and S-400 systems. And while ATACMS had performed well in earlier conflicts, these strikes really demonstrated pretty conclusively to the world that the U.S. Army's artillery fire systems, namely the M270 and M142 HIMARS, aren't just still viable in 21st century conflict against even a major regional power like Russia, they're arguably even among the most valuable systems on the battlefield. Of course, for the U.S. Army and Lockheed Martin, the firm which was responsible for ATACMS production and sustainment by then, well, this all came as no real surprise. In fact, while Ukraine was drawing headlines around the world with the performance of those American missiles that had largely been built in the 80s and 90s, Lockheed and the Army were already hard at work testing their much more modern replacement, the Precision Strike Missile. Now, this new weapon was built to provide a significant increase in effective range in a much smaller package, increasing Army artillery's maximum reach from roughly 190 miles to better than 310 in a weapon that's the same length but boasts a diameter that's more than 34% smaller, going from 24 inches to just 17, which was enough to double the carrying capacity of the HIMARS, which can carry 2 Prisms instead of just 1 ATACMS. And while going from 1 to 2 missiles might not sound like a huge jump, it is really important to understand that this is about more than just doubling the launch salvo. Being able to carry more smaller weapons with a similar battlefield effect has a massive impact on logistics and planning, while also slashing the number of launch platforms, or HIMARS and M270s, that you might need for some strike operations in half. But a boost in range and magazine depth were far from the only things that set this new Prism apart from its ATACMS predecessors, because some of the most important elements of the Prism design come down to, well, Lockheed Martin's implementation of the very real practices that are usually hidden behind some of the most common buzzwords in the defense space today: modularity and open system software architecture. Now, that's all to say that the precision strike missile that is already being used in combat against Iran is not this weapon's final form, despite being a serial production system. Instead, it is merely the first iteration of a series of missiles that are meant to deliver consistently higher performance and combat capabilities over time, taking a step-by-step approach toward maturing Prism into what may well become the most broadly capable ballistic missile ever conceived. Now, rather than falling into the traditional American trap of technological scope creep, or, trying to cram so much advanced capability into a new weapon that costs and timelines both balloon out of control, the US Army and Lockheed Martin started by just fielding the simple baseline requirements that they needed for an ATACMS replacement. Namely, doubling magazine depth, increasing range, and adding a GPS-assisted inertial navigation system that could strike stationary targets more effectively, even under heavy jamming. Now, in order to get more range out of a smaller weapon while still delivering the explosive payload equivalent of 20 Hellfire missiles, Lockheed Martin started by doing away with the ATACMS' more dated and traditional solid rocket motors provided by L3 Harris in favor of advanced new rocket designs from Northrop Grumman that are made out of lighter weight materials, deliver a more efficient nozzle design, and incorporate both higher energy composite fuel formulas and a very specific grain geometry within that fuel for a more efficient burn. Or to summarize that shift into pretty simple terms, Lockheed Martin replaced rockets that were designed in the 80s with rockets designed using the latest tech available in the 2020s, allowing for more power and more reach in a much smaller package. Now, that new engine, combined with its energetically dense and much more efficient fuel, delivered the necessary increased range and reduced size to double that missile capacity in the HIMARS. But a new GPS-assisted inertial navigation system, developed by Lockheed Martin Missiles and Fire Control, provided the resilient targeting capabilities this weapon needs to operate in jammed environments. In effect, this system uses inertial navigation as its core guidance infrastructure and employs modern jam-resistant GPS just to augment that system. Meaning the missile only needs sporadic access to a GPS signal, even if only before launch, to calculate its relative position using onboard accelerometers and gyroscopes to determine its course of travel from its last confirmed GPS position. Then the result was a new missile that offered a roughly 49% increase in range over even the most modern iterations of the ATACMS, and substantially improved performance in GPS-denied environments. The first prototype test launch of Lockheed's new missile design took place in December of 2019 and was meant to demonstrate simple flight performance when launched from the HIMARS. The weapon successfully struck its designated target area some 240 kilometers, or about 150 miles away, exceeding the range of the original ATACMS in testing before Lockheed even had a production contract. Lockheed's second preliminary flight test, this time meant to assess the missile's ballistic flight trajectory, its accuracy, and the efficacy of its new warhead, followed just 4 months later in March of 2020. That test was also a success, with the weapon launched once again from an M142 HIMARS and successfully finding its target roughly 180 kilometers, or about 111 miles away. And by the end of that same month, Boeing and Raytheon had both dropped out of the competition, leaving the contract to Lockheed, who was already progressing toward the program's goals. By October of 2021, the Prism racked up its 5th successful flight test in a row, this time focused on determining just how far that new engine and fuel combination could really go. And while the distance covered has not been disclosed, we do know that it exceeded the weapon's target reach of 499 kilometers by, seemingly a pretty sizable margin, giving the Increment 1 Prism a maximum range that extends somewhere beyond 310 miles. According to unclassified Army acquisition documents, the weapon's real maximum reach may actually extend as far out as 650 kilometers. That's more than 400 miles. Now that means the Prism may already be able to reach targets well over 4 times further away than the original ATACMS, and may even already be exceeding twice the range of the modern ATACMS in service right now. Of course, Lockheed Martin's spokespeople wouldn't confirm or deny any possible range estimations, but they did tell me a bit about why the Prism's testing regime moved so quickly and was so successful. And broadly speaking, it seems to have come down to Lockheed's own internal investment into expediting the effort. I'll quote them directly now. Lockheed Martin's decisive investment in the Precision Strike Missile program has been the key driver behind delivering this capability so quickly. By allocating significant resources and expertise, we were able to combine traditional separate test events into a full-up test, proving launch, navigation, and warhead performance together on the first flight, and dramatically compressing the schedule. Now, by 2024, Lockheed Martin had begun low-rate production of Increment 1 Prisms, delivering a total of 100 weapons by the time they reached initial operating capability in late 2025. And today, Prism production is continuing to ramp up, with a target of pumping out 400 weapons per year by 2028, with the price per missile dropping from around $3.5 million a weapon today to more like $1.6 million a weapon as production volume increases. And today, those Prisms are actively being used in combat to engage a variety of targets in Iran. In fact, just this morning, on Friday, March 13th, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, announced the first combat use of these weapons to strike targets deep inside Iran, launched by the 3rd Battalion, 27th Field Artillery Regiment out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And we'll actually get back to that soon, but for now, let's take a brief step back and talk about why the Prism's target range started out at 499 kilometers to begin with. I mean, that is a pretty specific figure, and it's actually because the early framework for this program came together starting in 2016, which was 3 years before Uncle Sam would formally withdraw from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty with Russia. Now, this treaty, signed by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev back in 1987, barred the development or testing of all ground-launched short and intermediate-range missile systems that could reach targets between 500 and 5,500 kilometers away. That's around 310 to 3,400 miles. But as is so often the case when it comes to making deals with Moscow, Russia soon began seeing this treaty as a means to limit American weapons development while they just went ahead fielding weapon systems that violated the treaty anyway. While Russia initially destroyed their deployed nuclear-tipped 9M729 cruise missiles in the early 90s because of this treaty, by 2017, it was confirmed that they had redeployed them, claiming a new maximum range of just 499 kilometers, which was in keeping with the treaty. But subsequent media reports soon revealed that these missiles' actual maximum range was more like 2,350 kilometers. Now, Russia obviously denied these reports and refused to pull those weapons out of service, which ultimately resulted in the US withdrawing from the INF treaty that Moscow refused to honor in 2019, thus allowing Prism development to shift toward extending those engagement ranges. And that extended range is not stopping at that current classified well north of 499 kilometers figure. As I mentioned before, the Prism program has been devised to deliver staged incremental improvements over time, incorporating more advanced and cutting-edge technologies only after the previous stage of advancements are mature and operational. The Army currently has plans laid out for 4 separate increments of Prism missiles, each of which build upon the capabilities of the last and incorporate more specialized or advanced capabilities. Increment 1, or the baseline Prism, is the weapon that's in service today, with, again, that stated range of well over 310 miles and the ability to strike stationary targets, even in jammed environments. Increment 2, which actually just completed its first flight test yesterday, builds upon that by adding a new multi-mode guidance system that includes both a radio frequency seeker and an infrared electro-optical seeker, allowing these ballistic missiles to close with and strike moving targets, including warships at sea. Now, that radio frequency seeker is a passive means of detection that is pretty similar in function to the anti-radiation seekers found in air defense hunting weapons like the AGM-88 HARM. But rather than being designed to hone in on specifically radar waves, the Prism's new seeker can detect and differentiate between a variety of different radio signals, using the type of signals likely to be broadcast by its intended target to help close with it once its GPS and inertial guidance gets it into the right neighborhood. Then, as the weapon continues to close with that target, it transitions to its infrared electro-optical seeker for terminal guidance and a high degree of accuracy. Now, according to Lockheed Martin, this first test of the Increment 2 Prism saw the weapon launch from an M142 HIMARS, deploy protective covers, and strike a moving maritime target at a range of some 350 kilometers, nearly 220 miles. And again, that was this weapon's first test. Now, what exactly those protective covers were isn't entirely clear. Now, earlier this week, there was a great deal of speculation about Increment 2 Prism weapons potentially already being deployed during Operation Epic Fury over Iran. And this theory really originated with CENTCOM announcing the use of artillery systems to strike targets in Iran, including ships, followed by later statements indicating that these systems had indeed been used to strike Iranian ships. Now, we know HIMARS systems have been deployed to Bahrain, for instance, thanks to images of them being posted online. And as Joseph Trevithick and Howard Altman pointed out for the Warzone this week, that would limit the weapons available to HIMARS commanders to only ATACMS and Prisms, as the standard rockets carried by the M142 have a maximum range of only around 93 miles. That's about 150 kilometers. And the minimum distance between Bahrain and Iran is, well, around 120 miles. So that means not only do we know for sure that ATACMS and Prisms were being used, but some number of Iranian ships were hit directly by HIMARS-launched ballistic missiles. And if these vessels were on the move at the time, well, hitting them shouldn't be possible with the current guidance systems found in these weapons. Now, I obviously reached out to the folks at Lockheed Martin Missiles and Fire Control to see if I could prove or disprove this theory, and in response, they very politely reminded me that the first successful test launch of Increment 2, or the Maritime Strike Prism, only took place about 48 hours ago, so I guess they're probably not being used in Iran. Now, that statement and footage released by CENTCOM of Iranian ships being struck in dock all suggests to me that while Prisms have indeed been confirmed to be used against Iranian targets, any ships hit by ATACMS or Prisms were all but certainly stationary at the time of the strikes. Now, the current timeline for getting the Maritime Strike Increment 2 iteration of the Prism into operational service is 2028, which, it's hard to believe, is actually right around the corner. Now, hard details about the next two increments are not as easy to find, but we do know that the broad strokes are focused on improving performance against hardened targets, i.e., improving penetration against reinforced bunkers and the like, and pushing the weapon's operational range to the extreme, with a new target of 1,000 kilometers, or about 621 miles. Now, in most media reporting, these two objectives are split between Increment 3 and Increment 4, but to be totally honest, we don't actually know how exactly these capabilities will manifest, and it's entirely possible that elements of each could be included in each increment. Now, the Army currently plans on paper to purchase a total of 3,986 Increment 1 missiles, followed by another 1,589 Increment 2 Prisms, just as soon as their production begins. But again, it is important to understand that production on Increment 1 is still spinning up as we speak, with original plans for the US to take delivery on 250 weapons in 2026, which is probably the top line for Lockheed Martin's still expanding production line. But that figure was cut to just 152 as a result of a funding decrease that so far has not been explained by the Pentagon and might actually indicate some degree of internal debate about funding priorities, with a long list of new Army programs making their way towards service as we speak, including the Army's new hypersonic glide vehicle, surface-to-surface missile dubbed Dark Eagle, that offers a reported range of some 1,725 miles against stationary targets. But while internal competition between funding priorities is honestly pretty common, what doesn't seem as common is a program that's progressed through development and testing with little in the way of technical roadblocks or budgetary headaches, that made it into combat service quickly and is seemingly already proving itself on the battlefield, and that, despite its existing capability, can only really be seen as the baseline for a long list of even more advanced capabilities to come. Because the truth is, people tend to think all defense acquisitions are overly expensive boondoggles because, well, the overly expensive boondoggles are the only stories that drive views or clicks or comments or all-important outrage. A story about a program that's just doing what it's supposed to do isn't really much of a story at all, so they're drowned out by the much more engaging headlines about programs gone awry. In a real way, this kind of reporting creates a type of survivorship bias, wherein the general public believes all defense programs are wasteful or chock full of problems just because those are the only programs that they ever hear about. So, here's one defense program that seems to be going broadly as it's supposed to for you to keep in mind next time you see someone in the comments saying that the US military's acquisition model is just too broken to succeed. Because it turns out, if you base your assessment only on the media's most favorite and most egregious outliers, well, you don't actually end up with a very good understanding of how things work at all. And with that, ends yet another edition of Firepower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.